Let me start with one story, which has nothing to do, seemingly, with Jewish history. And that is on the 15th of August, 1668, Gabriel de Magalhães, a Portuguese Jesuit in Beijing, a kinsman of the circumnavigator of the globe, wrote to the vice provincial and the visitator of the mission, putting his case in for ordaining Chinese, that is, native clergy, to advance the cause of Catholicism in China. In the recent persecutions against Christianity, Magalhães stated, the European fathers were all arrested, whereas the few native Chinese clerics managed to escape detection and continue their work. The case in China, he argued, differed from that in India, where plenty of European clergy ensured the survival of Catholicism. And it differed from the Americas, where the native peoples are too feeble to drive away the Catholic missionaries who were protected by the arms of the Catholic monarchs. Turning his argument back to China, Magalhães argues that Buddhism, originally a foreign religion to China, survived and thrived in China in spite of sporadic and fierce persecutions in Chinese history because of the growth of the native clergy, who ensured the domestication of Buddhism. This development, Magalhães lamented, reminded him of the situation in Portugal. I quote, "Why is it not possible to extinguish until now in Portugal in her possessions profaning Judaism, even when it is rigorously prohibited and castigated, as we see every day how we sigh and cry. It is impossible because the faithless and ingrate people has mixed with Portuguese blood." End of quotation. Strange argument, perhaps, for advancing the training of a native Chinese clergy, but the logic seems impeccable. In faraway Beijing, Magalhães was thinking about his native Portugal. Things were so much simpler when blood and religious identity seemed to coincide, but now the intermingling of peoples and the ambiguities of symbols have made the fight for true religion so much more difficult in his own time. In the same year, when Magalhães wrote this letter, the Jesuit missionaries in China debated fiercely a problem in conversion. Whether to require Chinese Buddhists and sectarians who had practiced vegetarianism to break their fasts before being admitted to baptism. The issue was indeed complicated, as it involved the Jesuit polemic against the doctrine of metempsychosis, or reincarnation, a key doctrine in Buddhism. It also involved whether to admit members of prohibited sects, generally labeled the White Lotus or the sect of vegetarians by imperial Chinese authorities, who rightly or wrongly suspected the sectarians as potential rebels. The question was put to all the Jesuit missionaries in China, and they wrote their reply with a majority of 23 arguing for the negative, that these people should not be admitted to baptism if they did not break their fasts. A minority of 13 fathers stated that in extraordinary cases, baptism should be permitted, arguing that in some cases it would be impossible for the fasters to break their fast because they had become so disgusted with meat that they can physically not be able to ingest meat. Among those who forcefully argued the two positions, the French Jesuit André Grémont fiercely upheld the negative opinion, while the Italian Prospero Intocetta pleaded for leniency and flexibility. Intocetta argued for the good intentions of the Chinese fasters and the fact that they only refused certain foods, arguments which Grémont vehemently rejected. The argument that the Chinese fasters are only refusing certain foods would also invalidate the arguments and works of the Inquisition in Europe, Grémont argued. The Inquisition that has cracked down on the dietary restrictions of the conversos, as a sign of their adherence to the old faith. Besides, the situation is worse in China, because whereas the Jews are tolerated in Europe, the sect of fasting is prohibited in China. Grelon continues, would the Holy Office give permission to the Jews who want to convert that for the love of God they would want to abstain from pork, blood, and other unclean foods, not only for one day, but for years and for the whole lifetime? Grelon doesn't think anyone would have the temerity to ask that of the Inquisition in Portugal, Spain, or in Rome. For Grelon, good intentions do not count, or intentions at all. If a Jew kneels before the statue of Christ, this is an act of respect. But if a Christian kneels before an idol while ridiculing the idol in his heart, this is still an act of sin. Moreover, the breaking of fast does not occur in private or in a forest, but in the full community among friends, relatives, family, and the entire community. It is the public act and not the private intention that counts for Grelon. This, of course, the public act and not the private intention that counts, goes to the heart of the dilemma, namely, the ambivalence of religious identity in an age of a Christendom torn asunder, a Christian Europe split into rival confessional camps, an early modern world society that produced martyrdom, dissimulation, conversions, and the multiple crossings of religious frontiers by Lutherans, Calvinists, Anabaptists, anti-Trinitarians, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists. In contrast to the European Middle Ages, with its distinct and strong contrast between ecclesia in synagoga, in the lens of the Ashkenaz, or in the more complex interplay between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism in the lens of the Sephardim, the early modern world has become far more slippery for pinpointing identities. The chronology of this development is well known, but bears repeating. And in the intersection between early modern Jewish and world histories, there are three themes that I simply want to echo here, which I'm sure that we will all discuss in the next couple of days. And I shall very briefly adumbrate on these themes, which are in turn religion, political economy, and cultural identity. The first theme is religion, which is obviously the most central theme for the early modern period, the Protestant Reformation and Jewish identity. We all know the story of Luther and the Jews, which was so crucial to the initial evangelical movement, Luther's tract of 1521, that Jesus Christ was a born Jew, to his later treatises written a few years before his death in the 1540s, attacking the Jewish people for their hard-heartedness. Throughout all of these tracts, what is the common theme was that Jews served as a metaphor. At first, in 1521, for the wrongs of the Roman Church, and for the hopes of conversion of all peoples, of course. And then ultimately in the 1540s tracts, a metaphor of obstinacy and hard-heartedness. Jews and Judaism became metaphors for evangelical understanding of the events that were unfolding in the Holy Roman Empire. The Anabaptist kingdom of Münster in the year 1534-35 provoked the polemics of a Protestant reformer, Urbanus Regius, who accused it as an act of Christian Judaic sedition. And Regius would later on in the 1540s and 50s write anti-Judaic tracts advocating the expulsion of Jews from the land of Hesse. Metaphor could be used from both sides, and from the Catholic opponents of the German Reformation, Luther and the other reformers were accused of as friends of Jews. A pamphlet written by a very minor reformer by the name of Johannes Birchenstein in 1521 is interesting because he pleads for the fact that he is not a Jew, but he was accused of as a converted Jew, since his name, Birchenstein, is a village in Swabia with many Jewish families. Wittgenstein said that although I have studied Hebrew, I'm a Hebrew scholar, I only support the cause of Luther and the gospel because it is the truth and not because I'm a converted Jew. I am not a Jew. Another example in this interconfessional polemic, using Jews and Judaism as a metaphor in this polemic, would be Johannes Eck's attack of the Protestant reformer Osiander's treatise that defended Jews against the charge of ritual murder, which was published in 1540. There you have again, between Christians who argue with one another, the tactic of smearing defenders of Jews as those who have accepted bribes, as it was in the case of Reuchlin, who defended the Jews. But things progressed as the Reformation progressed, from the Lutheran to the Calvinist phase, and in that process, the self-image adopted, especially by the Calvinist Church, and also by separatist Christian communities, of a new Israel, of a new chosen people, helped to refigure the imaginations of identity and community. We have here the strange example, and I'll just give one, of Balthasar Hubmaier, who was a Catholic cathedral preacher in the imperial city of Regensburg in 1519, instrumental in preaching anti-usury sermons against the Jews, using the rhetoric of blood and money to castigate Jews as bloodsuckers, and whipping up anti-Jewish rhetoric among the guilds of Regensburg that ultimately led to the expulsion of the Jewish community. Hubmaier would later become an Anabaptist and was beheaded in Vienna in 1529, dying as a martyr. Martyrdom, that is, produced new for Christians perhaps in the 16th century, of Christians executing one another, of Lutheran, Calvinist, Anabaptist, and even Catholic martyrs, would give a new dimension, if you will, to a landscape of religious confrontation in which, in the past, most of the martyrs of that conflict in the European Middle Ages were Jews. No longer was it exclusively martyrdom or largely a Jewish matter. But all the Christian confessions would create parallel martyrologies which mirrored subconsciously or unconsciously or consciously the language of Jewish martyrology. And here I shall refer you to the research of the current research of my ex-colleague, Miriam Bodiam, who is precisely studying the representation of Jewish martyrdom in Christian sources as well as in Jewish sources. There's a recent book written on comparing Christian martyrologies, but unfortunately this quite thorough monograph has completely ignored the question of Jewish martyrology. With the advent of the Reformed Church of Calvinism, in limited circumstances, for the first time, you have a strong current of philo-Semitism because of the identification of the Reformed Church within Israel, manifesting in itself this philo-Semitism in the study of Hebraica and the admission of Jews to countries, as we know, such as England, the Netherlands. But in general, the separatist communities, that is, the various Anabaptist communities, generally stayed clear of Judaism, although there were cases of conversion as early as the late 1520s, when Luther was complaining about Judaizers in his table talks. And in another example, in 1614 in the Dutch Republic, when two Mennonites, Hans Jostensson and his wife, converted to Judaism, and the two of them, in turn, converted an elder of the Reformed Church in Grooshausen, and all three of them were arrested, sentenced to die, but finally pardoned to exile by the Dutch authorities. In spite of the rigorous patrolling of confessional polemics and frontiers by the public authorities in this new polity, the United Provinces, the construction of a large gray zone of freedom between the private and the public, where different religious and immigrant groups must interact in daily life, enable the emergence of a complex religious landscape in which the simple contradistinction between a majority Christian and a minority Jewish population in the Middle Ages no longer obtained. My second major point, political economy. The example of the Mennonites and the Calvinists who converted to Judaism could perhaps only occur in this one unique polity that emerged out of the struggles of the early modern period, namely the Dutch Republic. The freedom of conscience in the United Provinces of the Netherlands is guaranteed in the Union of Utrecht in 1579, where Article 13 states, "Nobody shall be persecuted or examined for religious reasons." Not everybody agreed, of course. From the beginning of the discussion on religious plurality in the Netherlands, the Calvinist Church, the official church, vehemently opposed any official status for Catholicism, and the elders of the Reformed Church in Amsterdam repeatedly and strongly condemned the open practice of Judaism by Portuguese Jews who settled in the capital of Holland under the guise that they were Christians. Nevertheless, the magistrates of Amsterdam rigorously defended the rights of different confession and religious groups to coexist in the metropole, making the city synonymous with religious toleration and freedom for some, and a den of blasphemies for others. Defending himself against criticisms that he was making war on his fellow co-religionists, and this is an example of one who thought that it was not a good thing, religious toleration in Amsterdam, Colonel Jean-Baptiste Stolpe, the reformed Swiss commander of Louis XIV's troops in Utrecht during the occupation of 1672-673, defended himself that the Dutch were not reformed at all. I quote, "It is well known that in addition to the, quote, reformed," Stolpe wrote in his tract on the religion of the Hollanders, "there are Roman Catholics, Lutherans, Brownists, Independents, Armenians, Anabaptists, Socinians, Arians, Enthusiasts, Quakers, Borealists, Muscovites, Libertines, and many more. I am not even speaking of the Jews, Turks, and Persians. I must also report on an enlightened and learned man who has a great following. His name is Spinoza. He was born a Jew and had not sworn off allegiance to the Jewish religion, nor has he accepted Christianity. He is a wicked and very bad Jew, and not a better Christian either," end of quotation. Baruch Spinoza, descendant of the Jews of Espinosa in Portugal, neither Jew nor Christian, living in the new social space created by the multi-confessional early modern state. If Spinoza is the paradigm of the modern man, living a lonely existence between communities, earning his wages by his sheer intellect. Far more common, however, was still the pattern that obtained that only allowed the crossing of boundaries between religious confessions, which was the case for a father and a son, Johannes Isaac, and his son Stefan, whom Elisha Karabakh has studied. The father and son converted from Judaism to Lutheranism in 1546 in Hesse, in the Holy Roman Empire. Then a new conversion to Catholicism in Louvain, in the Low Countries, followed by a move to Cologne. When the father converted back to Protestantism and was estranged from his son, who was studying for the priesthood, under the mentor and guidance of the Jesuits. Trained by the Jesuits for anti-Protestant polemic, Stefan repudiated, in the end, the superstitious ceremonies of Catholicism and converted to Calvinism. So he tried all three major Christian confessions. Condemned by the Cologne Jesuits for his Jewish inconsistency, Stefan Isaac's search for a personal religious allegiance was actually perhaps not more fickle or unstable than that of the great Christian scholar of the early 17th century, Justus Lipsius, the Greek scholar of Neo-Stoicism, who changed professorships at Leiden and Leuven as he changed confessions. He was, after all, a student of the Jesuits, and he could make any argument to justify his actions. I am actually quite friendly to the Jesuits, so do not take that as an anti-Jesuit remark. In the clash between Christian confessions and the rise of a philosophy of reason of state, a greater political space was created in many states of early modern Europe, of which, of course, the Dutch Republic, I think, is the most, the most prominent example. The creation of this greater political space, however, I should argue, was intended not only for the Jews, but for minority religious groups, among whom the Jews would benefit. But they were not the only ones. In addition to the example of the Dutch Republic, where Jews enjoyed greater privileges than Catholics or Mennonites until the 19th century, one could point to the remission of Jews to England and the religious toleration in the Principality of Transylvania until its incorporation by the Habsburgs in the late 17th century, where all Christian confessions, including the anti-Trinitarians and the Jews, were tolerated. Or take the case of Poland, until the Counter-Reformation triumphed over toleration in the second half of the 17th century. And in many principalities of the Holy Roman Empire, where the princes took advantage of the expulsion of Jews from the free imperial cities in the 16th century to gain economically productive and tax-bearing subjects in the domain. This development, which picked up pace in the late 16th century, became the dominant feature of Jewish life in the 17th and 18th centuries, and paved the way for the appearance of the court Jew in the mercantilist economy of the early modern German state. The shining example of that symbiosis was Brandenburg Prussia, ruled by a Calvinist dynasty in a deeply Lutheran land, welcoming of Huguenot and Jewish immigrants who pioneered the creation of a factory system in the 18th century, for example, the production of tobacco, contributing to the creation of an efficient fiscal and militarist state that would one day unite Germany and grant emancipation to the Jews of Central Europe. My third and final point, cultural identity. The Jews of Amsterdam, who of course were proud of their ancestral religion and who recovered that identity when they were free from the confines of the Holy Office in Portugal, turned proud, however, of the cultural identity, the fact they would write in Portuguese and Spanish. They were Jews of the Portuguese nation who were, of course, far more superior to the German-speaking Jews from the Ashkenazi lands. Not to speak of the cheese-eating Dutch in the Cloaken, whose language they did not learn until well into the 18th century. Religion and cultural identities were thus, in this case, uncoupled. Portuguese Jews could be proud they were Portuguese as long as they were not in Portugal. Cultural identities and religion uncoupled, with cultural identities defined by language, by the rites of passage, if you will, as opposed to purely religious liturgies, by footways, by dress, and by a whole number of other symbols and practices. One indicator, it seems to me, of this decoupling of religion and culture is in the rise of Jewish ethnography, a development that occurs from outside, if you will, the trajectory of Jewish history. And I have written a little bit on this in the setting of the German lands, where if you would compare the transcript of the Trent 1475 trial, and Ken is going to share with us some of those documents, where every liturgical gesture in the trial records would condemn the Jews as ritual murderers. In other words, no separation between culture, language, liturgy, and religion. To, in about 2 generations' time, to the first ethnography of Jews in which Jewish rites are disenchanted, if you will, from the accusations of ritual murder, of well poisoning, and of host desecration. In other words, this is part of the story of the rise of Christian Hebraica, which has been written extensively. My point here is simply that this movement occurred in tandem with the Protestant Reformation, and when you look at the number of people who wrote in the first half of the 16th century, or even in the second half of the century, they were all Protestants, or they were Jewish converts. A number of names, such as Sebastian Frank, who wrote on Jewish 613 Gebote und Verbote Juden, on the laws and of the Jews, or Sebastian Münster, who was a cosmographer and also Hebraist, to other people who were converts. It doesn't really matter whether they converted to Catholicism and Protestantism, and that is the interesting thing. But the common enterprise was to show the Christian world the erroneous way in which the Jewish people were being persecuted. They agree with the goal of conversion, but it has to be by polemical doctrinal argument. Names such as Anton Margarita, famous for his work, Der ganz Jüdisch Glaub, or Paul Richius, who was the personal physician to Emperor Maximilian I, and a number of such names which I will not bother you with. In other words, beginning with the 16th century, you have the distinction in writing between Jews, Judaism, and folkways. There is a specific identity now created for Jews and Judaism, which is not essentially and exclusively religious. The rise of Hebraica goes hand in hand with the rise of an ethnography. This convert literature, which arose in the 16th century, developed side by side with another genre, that is, the rise of popular histories of the Israelites, written generally by non-Jews, by Christians, usually by Protestants, based on Old Testament stories, such as a work in 1518 which was anonymous, called The Three Faiths, and then a work by Bartholomeus Stenius in 1523, which is really about a summary of the Old Testament story. Some of them were written for a more popular audience, and they were written in German rather than in Latin, such as the work by Caspar Thurnauer from on the Jewish and Israeli people and their ancestors, which was published in 1928. We have a number of these books in the early 16th century, and this tradition would go and continue in the German world into the 18th century with the more well-known and much more voluminous work of a Johann Jakob Schutt on die jüdische Merkwürdigkeiten. The last point I want to make about the rise of this ethnography of the Jew is that it paralleled the development and the emergence of a Christian ethnography of non-European peoples, which came about because of the Catholic missions overseas. Franciscan works on Mexico, both on language, on the superstitions, and on the folkways of the conquered peoples. Jesuit works on Hindu and Brahminic rites, and of course, the few that I'm working on now, Jesuit writings on Confucianism. The rise of a comparative ethnography, without the words ever being used, is absolutely apparent in a work such as the one by the Italian Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci, the founder of the China Mission, who arrived in China in 1583 and whose work was published after his death, first in Latin, in the Latin translation, and later on in the 20th century in the Italian original, Storia dell'introduzione del cristianismo in Cina, in which the first chapters after the geography are chapters that compare the different sectarii, the different followings, namely followers of Confucius, followers of Buddha, followers of Taoism, and then with 2 sections on Judaism and Islam. There, without naming it, you have the beginning of a comparative ethnography in which religion, culture, and the peoples can be separated out conceptually in an early modern world, which created far more complex spaces. Since I began with the Jesuits, allow me to end with the Jesuits. It's still J. I mean, I've been working my whole life only on 2 letters, J and C. I'm not a Kabbalist. I'm certainly not a Christian Kabbalist, but it's just by coincidence that these are the only letters I've ever worked on. Henrique Henriques, Portuguese Jesuit, apostle among the Tamil speakers of South Asia in India, a converted Jew, who moved out of the Portuguese enclave of Goa, where many, if you will, old Christian Portuguese Jesuits never left, never wanted to leave, and believed that the only way to convert for the natives is to become Lusophone Portuguese, second class, of course. Or to other examples, again within the Jesuit order, the second general after Ignatius, Diego Lainez, again of Converso family, but then the head now of a well-sprung organization of cultural mobilizers who can decouple religion from anything, as the opponents in the Catholic Church would charge them. I shall end with 2 stories, one again going back to Matteo Ricci, who, when he was in Beijing, met a Chinese Jew who told him about the Jewish community in Kaifeng, where he went to investigate, and from that point onwards, the Jesuits in China until the middle of the 18th century were extremely interested in Jewish antiquities in China. From the 1610s onwards, there was always a Jesuit mission in Kaifeng, and one of the charges was always to find out about what is going on with the Jewish community and try to get stuff out of them. It got to the point where in the middle of the 18th century, a French Jesuit, Antoine Gourbiel, was trying to persuade a friend, a patron of his at the imperial court, a Manchu prince, and said, can you just confiscate all these Jewish stuff from Kaifeng and give them to us so we could ship them back to Europe? That never happened. But what did happen, again in terms of the decoupling, if you will, of personal identity and culture and religion, was that Matteo Ricci was offered the rabbinate at Kaifeng, a post which he gently refused to continue to be the great Jesuit missionary he was. Thank you very much.